What's up guys, Brady Fagil here coming at you with a review for the new Turnstile album, Never Enough, released this past Friday, June 6th. This is the fourth album by this hardcore punk band that many people seem to be really getting behind. Like, this band has some passionate fans, and I always respect that, but admittedly it does make it a little bit intimidating as far as doing a review for this album. But I will say, although I don't consider myself a fan of this band per se, I did enjoy a few songs off of their last album, and I honestly haven't really explored much of their first two records. So if you are a fan of this band and you watch throughout this entire review, and you kind of take into account some of my criticisms and some of my praises, feel free to comment below if you think I might enjoy one of those first two records. And I will preface by saying that in this review, I may have some criticisms that aren't in particular about this album, and rather just kind of their style of somewhat dated punk and hardcore punk. So I'm going to do my best to be objective and kind of separate those criticisms from my overall opinion about this album. One thing I was hoping for going into it was kind of a good balance between having that kind of dated classic punk feel while still taking on some modern influences. Because if it was just full on, just like derivative 80s and 90s punk and hardcore, I don't know if I'd really be able to get behind that. It would just feel too derivative for me. And there are moments, actually several moments on this album that kind of do, or that are a bit too just derivative in that sense for me to enjoy. But there are also a few tracks on here that do give me what I want. Like the intro track, which is also the title track, Never Enough, has these just gorgeous layers of synthesizers that really complement Brendan's very spacious sounding vocals. This song is very atmospheric, and it also is very uplifting, which is a little bit unconventional for hardcore. And speaking of unconventional for hardcore, I also really enjoy that very tuneful guitar solo that happens just before the halfway mark through this song. This is one of a few examples on this album where they do depart from the straight up punk and hardcore sound on here. And honestly, taking into account this full album, I know they are considered hardcore, and I think the band even themselves consider themselves hardcore, but I don't hear much hardcore punk influence on this album. This might just be one of those kind of genre-wide like things going on now, because like take into account like when the first wave of metalcore really came in, those hardcore punk bands that incorporated more metal in like the late 90s, like your Earth Crisises and your Integrities and your Converges, that kind of really evolved hardcore and made it a lot more heavy. And same goes for the more recent metalcore bands that have taken the sound back to the origins in hardcore, like your Knocked Looses and your Kubla Khans and your Harm's Ways and Jesus Piece. Taking into account context like that, this album's kind of biggest umbrella genre to me is just straight up punk rock. As much as I enjoy the vocals on here, like they don't lean hardcore at all. They lean, to me, just again straight up punk rock. They're very clean and smooth sounding. They don't get harsh like at all. Even on tracks like Sunshower and Birds on this record that are a lot more aggressive in comparison to other songs, the vocals in particular, the harshest they get is when Brendan's kind of just like yelling like that. It's still a very like clean and almost polished sounding yell. I don't mean polished production wise, I just mean just his delivery in particular. There really isn't any of that gruffness I get from like obviously the late 90s metallic hardcore, or any of like that first wave of like tough guy hardcore. I understand this is just me taking into account context, and several of the songs on here, the more aggressive ones in particular, do take a bit more influences from the older generations of hardcore punk, like your Madballs and your Bad Brains. It's just that to me, hardcore has evolved so much past that this style doesn't really feel hardcore to me. Does that make sense? Like the riffs in Soul and Dull and Dreaming, they don't give me that adrenaline rush that I think they kind of try to. This album, in my opinion, is at its best when it incorporates other genres of music into it. Like I already singled out the title track, the first song on here. I absolutely love that song. There's the track I Care, which has much more of a subdued kind of punk rock vibe to it that incorporates a bit more of like an indie and alt-rock influence with those kind of dissonant guitars that ring throughout. Seein Stars later in the record has like this classy, almost synthwave, synth rock type vibe to it that I think is pretty cool. On the heavier side, the track Slowdive has this real catchy, bouncy main riff to it that instantly brought Rage Against the Machine to mind. And there's also moments in that song vocally where Brendan's harsh vocals, to me, feel a bit more comfortable in that particular style. And there's also the track Seein, which kind of sort of just functions as an interlude track. It's just over a minute long, but it does bring in some very unique ideas in the full album context, in a sense that the vocals are a bit more synthesized and almost edited, but it allows this song to serve as like this atmospheric breather between some of the other more aggressive songs on here, while also complementing the melodies that surround this track. Like the transition from that ending part of Look Out For Me, where it's just pretty much synths for the last 3 minutes, into this song, does make for a pretty cool transition in that full album context. And then, of course, it transitioned into Seein Stars, which is one of the most melodic tracks on here. That 3-song sequence is probably my favorite 3-track sequence on this album. In fact, I actually think the ideas in that track Seein weren't quite fleshed out enough. I think they could have done more with it and maybe made like more of a full-length track with it. Now, I just gave some examples of a few tracks on here where the band's experimentation and incorporation of other sounds into this overall punk rock sound pays off for them. But I also do have to give some examples of when they kind of venture out and it doesn't do it for me. Like on Birds, like essentially just after the halfway mark in the song, you get some like Limp Bizkit nu metal style rappy vocal cadences that just kind of take me back to 2001 in a not so great way. And then Magic Man, the closing track on here, is a song where it's pretty much fully synths and vocals, and that's it. But the thing with that is, if you're gonna do a song like that, you gotta either incorporate tons of emotive and full melodies, or just make it really catchy and get stuck in your head. And this track doesn't do either of those things. I enjoy the vocals on here, like I've said already for this album. They do sound very just pristine and smooth sounding. They're very pleasant to listen to, but they're not enough on this song in particular to carry the weight of the track and really make it a memorable song. And it's especially saying something considering this is the closing track on the album. That intro part on the title track does what this song tries to do way better. And another thing I haven't even touched on yet is that this album is a long ass fucking album. It's 14 tracks and 45 minutes long. And the result of that is an album that feels like there are at least a few filler tracks. Like Time Is Happening is one that immediately jumped out to me as a filler track. There are not nearly enough catchy vocal cadences or catchy guitar parts or memorability, anything like that in this song to make me want to come back to it. And in the album context, it doesn't add anything to the album that hasn't already been said in much better ways at that point, considering this is the second to last song on here. And same with the track Dreaming earlier in the record. Again, I don't think there's enough like catchiness or hookiness to make this a memorable track. And again, in the full album context, other songs do what this song tries to do a bit better. And a side note on this track, I don't know who thought that the trumpets were a good idea, but those trumpet parts make for some of the goofiest instrumental sections I have heard in any music all year. I think especially the fact that this is overall a punk rock record, which is a genre known for its to-the-pointness, to coin a term, and its compactness, that a nice tight 10, maybe 11 track album would have been a much more commanding statement. If it were me, I would have taken out the last 2 tracks on here, Time Is Happening and Magic Man, as well as Dreaming earlier in the record, make this an 11-track album, have it end on Slowdive, which in my opinion is one of the best songs on here, and it just would be a much more inviting and repeatable listen, at least for me. Now, I understand that a lot of these criticisms that I'm giving to this album might, again, just be attributed to the genre that it's going for, but one criticism I have to give this album that applies to just specifically this album is that, to me, it relies a bit too much on repeated lines and phrases for the choruses and the hooks and the refrains. Like, look out for me, his heart's hanging on by a thread. How many times does he tell you that? In Dull, he's going dull. Soul, even songs I like on here, like the title track and Seein Stars, like a lot of these songs just repeat the same lines over and over, and that's supposed to be a memorable hook. To me, it just feels repetitive, and honestly, lyrically, it feels a little lazy. Production-wise, I will say that I do think overall it strikes a pretty good balance between having that somewhat dated 80s, 90s style punk rock sound while still incorporating some modern influences. The track I Care is probably the best instance of that, where overall it does have that very 80s style synthy production to it. But just prior to the halfway mark, you get like these bubbly synthesizers that I think just sound so amazing. And it's like the little moments like that that really complement the song. And also, of course, Never Enough, the title track, and Seein. Just like the tracks that are more synth-focused, I think is where this production really strikes that perfect balance. And the vocals, taken for what they are, do also sound, like I mentioned earlier, very pleasant to listen to. Brendan's vocal performance on this record, he does really sound smooth, and he almost sounds fluid at some points, like he can just be absorbed into like the overall mix and act as like an instrument. And even though I made that comment earlier about how his more like aggressive vocals on here don't really give me that adrenaline rush like I mentioned earlier, he still sounds good. That was less a criticism and more just me trying to categorize this record. But that about does it. To me, this album does have its moments for sure. And if you're a fan of classic punk and classic hardcore, you're probably all over this record, and that is awesome. But to me, it really does feel like the band here is playing somewhat of an outdated style. This album gets a 14 out of 30 for me. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Remember to hit subscribe for more rock and metal-related content and album reviews, and comment your thoughts below for this album if you've heard it. Also, check the description of the video for my Instagram, Spotify, Threads links, as well as a link to my original music. Thank you all again so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. Peace.